In the beginning, humanity believed it had reached the stars as equals. When the first Terran ships pierced the veil of interstellar space, Earth's people carried with them dreams of cooperation, of peace, of sharing knowledge among the stars. They expected a warm welcome, an invitation to join the great galactic family they had long imagined was out there. Instead, they were met with shackles. The first contact with the Galactic Council had seemed promising. Representatives of 100 alien species came with smiles, gifts, and treaties. They spoke of unity and shared destiny, but beneath their words was a quiet condescension. They saw humanity not as partners, but as tools, a young, naive species too weak to stand on its own. It began subtly. Trade agreements that stripped Earth of its resources, labor exchanges that removed millions from their homes. But within a century, the illusion of partnership was gone. Humanity was property. The Council's laws called them indentured auxiliaries. In reality, they were slaves. Human men and women were shipped across the stars to work in mines beneath poisonous skies, to harvest crops on worlds they would never call home, to fight in wars they did not start. Human children were raised in alien cities, taught to serve and obey, forbidden to learn their own history. Their language was outlawed in many systems. Their cultures were mocked and erased. Entire nations disappeared under the weight of galactic civilization. And every species played a part. The Jarak traded in human labor, selling them like cattle to colonies on the galactic rim. The Forians used human soldiers as disposable cannon fodder, throwing them against enemy lines until the bodies formed bridges of flesh. The elegant, scholarly Tirikians hosted lavish debates about the philosophy of servitude, while humans scrubbed their floors. Even those species who claimed neutrality still bought human goods at slave markets, their silence a quiet endorsement of the cruelty. Earth screamed for help, no one listened. The Terran governments fell one by one. Their fleets were dismantled, their weapons confiscated. 100 resistance movements rose, and 100 were crushed. Humanity's spirit, once proud and fierce, was broken beneath the boot of the galaxy. The name Earth became a joke, a word whispered with pity or contempt. And yet not all hope was lost. Beneath the layers of despair, small sparks of defiance endured. On distant mining worlds, humans taught forbidden songs to their children. In the darkness of slave barracks, they carved messages of rebellion into the walls. Secretly, they passed down stories of a time when humanity had stood tall, of warriors and scientists, poets and dreamers who had shaped their destiny with their own hands. And in the hearts of a few, anger grew. One such man was Elias Cain. Born in a labor camp orbiting the gas giant Eridas, he had never seen Earth with his own eyes. His mother died in a refinery accident when he was 10. His father was executed for organizing a protest when he was 16. At 20, Cain was conscripted into a Forian war regiment and sent to fight in a war he didn't understand. He survived barely, but the experience carved something into his soul that nothing could erase: hatred. Hatred not just for those who had enslaved his people, but for those who had allowed it. When he escaped during a transport raid 5 years later, he disappeared into the black edges of space. The council branded him a terrorist. The slave overseers called him a ghost. Among his people, he became something else, a symbol. Rumors spread through the slave networks, stories of ships with no transponders striking convoys in the dark, of factories exploding without warning, of slavers vanishing without a trace. The whispers all had the same name: Cain. But Cain was more than one man. Over the decades, he gathered what remained of Earth's old military, hidden arsenals, forgotten shipyards, scattered fragments of the Terran fleet. He found scientists willing to build weapons in secret, engineers ready to resurrect old war machines. Most of all, he united humanity's anger. It took 50 years, but by the time the galaxy began to notice, it was already too late. The chains that had once bound humanity were beginning to rust. On the slave world of HFY 4, a young girl named Marin watched the twin suns rise over the mines. She had never seen a bird. She had never touched grass. Her mother told her stories of Earth, a world of oceans and skis, of music and freedom, but to Marin they sounded like fairy tales. Then one morning, the sky split open. A fleet of ships unlike any the galaxy had seen descended from orbit. They bore no insignia, no flags, only the white and blue mark of a planet none had spoken of in centuries, a circle of green and blue Earth. The overseers panicked, the guards fled, and for the first time in living memory, human slaves walked free. It was a small victory, one of many to come, but for Marin and billions like her, it meant something unimaginable: hope. The galaxy watched these events unfold with disdain. "The humans are angry," they sneered. "Let them have their tantrum, they are nothing. They cannot challenge us." They were wrong. Because humanity had learned something in its centuries of suffering, something the slavers had never understood. Rage is not a spark, it is a storm, and the storm was coming. The species that once believed humans were too weak to fight would soon learn the most important lesson in galactic history. They should have killed Earth when they had the chance. The uprising on HFY 4 was not the first act of rebellion, but it was the first to succeed. And when news of it spread through the slave networks, it did more than inspire hope, it lit a fire. For centuries, humanity had been broken, scattered across 1,000 worlds, too far apart and too afraid to rise together. But now they whispered a new name in the darkness: Cain. Elias Cain's first broadcast appeared without warning. On every human labor camp, every slave freighter, every mining colony, hollow screens flickered to life, and a scarred man with steel-gray eyes stared back. His voice was calm but cold, like tempered iron. "My name is Elias Cain. I was born in chains like you. I have bled for masters who called themselves civilized. I have buried friends who were killed for daring to dream of freedom. And I tell you now, the galaxy believes we are weak. They believe our spirits are broken. They are wrong. They will regret every whip, every cage, every lash, because we are coming, and we will never be slaves again." The speech was short, but it was enough. Across the galaxy, millions of humans, miners, soldiers, laborers began to resist in small, desperate ways. Tools went missing. Ship engines malfunctioned. Entire shipments vanished into deep space. The rebellion that had once seemed impossible was now spreading like wildfire. Cain did not act alone. In the shadowed corners of forgotten space, he found others who shared his fury. There was Dr. Lion Joe, a former scientist enslaved by the Tirikians, who had smuggled out research that would become the backbone of Earth's new weapons. There was Alari Zen, a captured pilot who had defected from the very fleet that once hunted humans, bringing with her critical intelligence about council fleets and bases. And there were thousands of nameless men and women, engineers, hackers, saboteurs, who risked everything to give the rebellion teeth. At first, the galaxy dismissed Cain's attacks as scattered acts of terrorism. Patrol fleets were dispatched, arrests made, and propaganda spread through every media channel. Human criminals, they called them, barbaric insurgents, but the cracks in their control were growing. Slave transports began vanishing without a trace. Entire mining colonies reported equipment failures hours before they exploded into flame. A council governor's shuttle was hijacked mid-transit and dropped into the gravity well of a star. Each attack was more coordinated, more daring, more devastating than the last. And then came the moment that shook the galaxy to its core. A massive convoy carrying over 1 million enslaved humans was intercepted en route to the Jarak homeworld. Council ships arrived at the wreckage expecting to find the bodies of their cargo. Instead, they found the convoy's escorts destroyed and every single human gone. Days later, the same slaves appeared in deep space aboard Terran ships, waving a new flag, a black star wreathed in silver flame. Humanity's banner had returned. The council held emergency meetings. Species that had once mocked Earth's weakness now whispered in fear. How are they doing this? Where are they hiding? How did they build ships? The truth was simple. Humanity had never forgotten how to fight. They had simply been biding their time. On the outer rim world of Yareth Prime, Kane stood in the command center of a captured orbital station. Around him, screens displayed raids, sabotage operations, and new cells forming every day. "How many now?" he asked quietly. "Nearly 3 million free humans," replied Dr. Joe, "and growing. Every week more escape. Every week more join the cause." Kane stared at the galaxy map, his jaw tight. "It's not enough," he murmured. "We're still scattered. We need something bigger, something they can't ignore." "They already can't ignore us," Alari said from across the room. "They will," Kane replied, "until they fear us." That something bigger came sooner than anyone expected. 6 months later, Kane's forces launched Operation Starfall, their boldest strike yet. Their target, the slave processing station orbiting the Forian capital. It was a fortress, defended by 3 fleets and equipped with the most advanced defenses in the galaxy. The assault lasted 3 days. Human ships, old freighters converted into warships, stealth corvettes built in secret, and massive carriers forged from the remains of ancient Terran vessels, tore into the defenses with brutal efficiency. They used tactics no alien fleet had seen before: suicide rams, EMP bursts, kinetic slingshot maneuvers. For every ship Kane lost, 3 of theirs burned. When the smoke cleared, the Forian station was gone, reduced to a drifting field of molten metal. And in its place, a single transmission echoed across the galaxy. "You have enslaved us for centuries. You treated us as tools, you called us beasts. Now we are free, and now we are hunters." Billions watched the footage in silence. The great powers who had once laughed at humanity's insignificance now found themselves studying every report, every intercepted transmission, every whisper. The humans had not just rebelled, they were winning. Far from the front lines, in a council chamber on the capital world of Viron, delegates shouted over one another in fear and anger. "The humans are destabilizing the trade routes. They've destroyed 6 fleets in 2 cycles. We must negotiate before it's too late." But for many, negotiation was unthinkable. They had spent centuries believing themselves invincible, unchallengeable. To bend now, to admit fault, it would mean admitting their crimes. So they made a choice, a foolish, fatal choice. The council issued a formal declaration. The human resistance was to be exterminated. Entire fleets were mobilized. Armies were raised. Dozens of species pledged their support. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that by doing so, they had sealed their fate. Because humanity was no longer fighting for freedom. They were fighting for vengeance. And vengeance, once awakened, would consume everything in its path. The galaxy thought it understood war. For thousands of years, empires had clashed in the void, fleets trading plasma fire, armies landing on distant worlds, treaties signed and broken in endless cycles. But nothing in their long history had prepared them for humanity's wrath. When the Council declared total war against the human resistance, they expected a short campaign. They believed their fleets would sweep the rebels aside in weeks. After all, humanity was still outnumbered, outgunned, and scattered. They controlled no worlds, held no territory. The Council's admirals boasted that they would crush the uprising before it reached their borders. But Kane knew they were wrong. He had spent decades studying the enemy, understanding their tactics, their arrogance. He knew the galaxy's fleets were powerful but predictable. They relied on overwhelming force, on conventional battles. Humanity, on the other hand, had nothing left to lose, and that made them far more dangerous. The first engagement stunned the Council. Their fleets advanced in perfect formation, confident in their numbers. Then they vanished. Entire battle groups disappeared without a trace, ambushed in asteroid belts, lured into gravity traps, shredded by minefields that hadn't existed a day before. Human ships attacked like ghosts, striking fast and disappearing before the enemy could react. In one infamous battle near the Jarak border, a fleet of 400 Council warships pursued what they believed was a lone Terran frigate. The frigate led them into a debris field filled with dormant drones, thousands of autonomous strike craft built from salvaged scrap. When they activated, the swarm overwhelmed the fleet, destroying or disabling every ship in less than 20 minutes. Only one vessel survived, a battered cruiser that limped back to friendly space carrying a single message. "We are the storm you created." The resistance was no longer a scattered rebellion. Under Kane's leadership, it had become an organized war machine. Secret shipyards hidden in nebulae churned out warships. Hidden colonies became training grounds for soldiers. Former slaves from a dozen species, the same species who once watched humanity suffer, now fought alongside them, united by shared pain and rage. And with each victory, humanity grew bolder. They began targeting not just fleets but infrastructure, fuel depots, shipyards, communication relays. They sabotaged hyperlane gates, stranding fleets light years from their supply lines. They hijacked cargo convoys and turned them into mobile missile platforms. Every time the Council adapted, the humans changed their strategy again, always staying one step ahead. The galaxy began to understand this was not a conventional war. It was total, unrelenting vengeance. Admiral Shar of the Forian Navy stared at the tactical map in disbelief. Red markers destroyed fleets, fallen outposts, vanished patrols spread across the screen like a disease. "This is impossible," he growled. "They shouldn't have the numbers for this." "They don't," replied his aide, a nervous young officer. "But they're using tactics we've never seen. They're not trying to hold territory. They're trying to make it impossible for us to." Shar slammed his clawed hand on the console. "Then we hunt them down. We burn every world they hide on." But that was the problem. The humans weren't on worlds. They had no capital, no homeworld to strike, no single target that would end the war. They were everywhere and nowhere, 1,000 scattered embers burning the galaxy from the inside out. On the bridge of the TSS Vengeance, Kane stood silently as his fleet emerged from hyperspace. Before them floated a massive orbital fortress, one of the primary hubs for the Tirikian slave trade. For centuries, humans had been bought and sold there like cattle. Today, it would burn. "Launch all wings," Kane ordered. Hundreds of ships surged forward, cutting through the fortress's defenses like a blade through glass. The Tirikian garrison fired desperately, but their shots struck empty space. The Terrans were too fast, too unpredictable. Boarding parties stormed the station, freeing tens of thousands of slaves before overloading its reactor. As the fortress exploded in a blinding wave of fire, Kane's voice echoed across the galactic network once more. "You built your empires on our suffering. Every chain you forged, every lash you struck, we remember. And now, we will erase you as you erased our freedom." The message spread like wildfire. On worlds across the galaxy, enslaved humans rose up, emboldened by the knowledge that they were not alone. Entire labor camps rebelled, overwhelming their guards and seizing ships. For every rebel who fell, 10 more took their place. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival, they were fighting for revenge. But vengeance had a price. The Council, desperate and furious, responded with brutality. Worlds suspected of aiding humans were bombarded into ash. Entire populations were executed as examples. Slave uprisings were crushed under orbital fire. Billions died. Yet instead of breaking their resolve, this only fueled humanity's rage. The more the galaxy tried to destroy them, the harder they fought. And slowly, the balance of power began to shift. The galaxy's great fleets, once unstoppable, now fought a war they could not win. Their massive dreadnoughts were useless against guerrilla strikes. Their vast empires were too slow to adapt. Every day, more species, once loyal to the Council, began questioning whether humanity was truly the enemy. Some even defected, joining the resistance and bringing ships, weapons, and intelligence with them. One night aboard the hidden station known as Eden's Shadow, Kane stood alone at a viewport, staring at the stars. The war was far from over, but for the first time in his life, he felt something close to hope. "They called us weak," he whispered. "They called us broken." He clenched his fist, the stars reflected in his steel-gray eyes. "But we are neither. We are the storm they feared, and the storm is only just beginning." And across the galaxy, that storm continued to rise. Worlds burned, empires trembled, and for the first time in thousands of years, the galaxy began to understand the cost of its cruelty. Humanity had been forged in chains. Now it was tempered in fury. And nothing, no fleet, no empire, no god could stand in its way. The storm that humanity had become was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a scream across the stars. The galaxy, once arrogant and confident in its power, now trembled every time a Terran signal appeared on the edge of a star system. Entire civilizations that had once looked down on Earth now fortified their skis and reinforced their fleets, knowing that somewhere out there, the humans were coming. The Terran resistance had grown beyond anyone's imagination. What had started as scattered guerrilla cells was now a full-fledged war machine. Human engineers, once forced to build ships for their masters, now built vessels of their own, lean, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. Captured enemy ships were refitted with Terran technology, their slave collars melted down and reforged into weapons of liberation. The Terran Retribution Fleet was born. It was not the largest fleet the galaxy had ever seen, but it was the deadliest. Every ship was a symbol of rage, every missile a message carved from centuries of humiliation. And leading them, at the helm of the flagship Eclipse, was Elias Kane, a man no longer seen as a rebel, but as the executioner of a broken galaxy. Their first true campaign was not a raid, not a hit-and-run strike. It was an invasion. The target, Draxion Prime, the beating heart of the Jarek slave empire. For over 200 years, billions of humans had been processed, auctioned, and shipped from Draxion's great slave markets. It was a place of horror and despair, where families were torn apart under the indifferent gaze of their masters. Kane had sworn long ago that if he ever had the power, he would erase it from existence. And now he did. The assault began at dawn. Terran warships slipped out of hyperspace like shadows, forming an iron ring around the planet before the defenders even knew they were under attack. The Jarek fleets rushed to intercept, confident in their superior numbers. They never stood a chance. Human ships did not fight like the Councils. They didn't form neat formations or follow predictable battle doctrines. They struck like predators, coordinated chaos that the enemy could not counter. Swarms of fighters disabled enemy engines with precision strikes. Railgun rounds, dense, kinetic projectiles traveling at a fraction of light speed, tore through capital ships like paper. Entire cruisers exploded before their captains even realized they were under fire. Within hours, the Jarek defense fleet was gone. Then the real vengeance began. The slave markets of Draxion were stormed by ground troops, humans clad in dark combat armor, their banners fluttering beneath burning skis. For the first time in centuries, human boots marched through the plazas not as slaves but as conquerors. Chains were broken, prison doors shattered, and billions of enslaved men, women, and children saw the impossible, Terran soldiers handing them weapons and saying, "You are free." The world that had been the symbol of humanity's suffering became a monument to their fury. Kane ordered the central auction house, once the largest slave market in the galaxy, demolished live on every broadcast channel. As the massive spire crumbled to dust, he delivered a message that echoed across the stars. For centuries you believed we were weak, that our chains made us less, but every blow you struck, every life you stole, it forged us. And now we are here, not as servants but as judgment. Remember this sight, because every world that built its power on human suffering will share Draxion's fate. The fall of Draction Prime sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Panic spread like wildfire. The Council's fleets scrambled to respond, but they were too slow, too fractured, too divided. Terran forces were already moving to their next targets: the Forian war factories, the Tirikian research colonies, the Valkan slave farms. One by one, the pillars of the slave system collapsed, and humanity showed no mercy. Worlds that had once profited from the sale of humans were glassed from orbit. Cities where humans had been hunted for sport were leveled to ash. Space stations where children had been auctioned like property were torn apart piece by piece. Entire civilizations, centuries old, vanished in weeks, erased from history by the fire of Terran vengeance. The Council begged for peace. Kane ignored them. "You want peace," he broadcast in reply. "Where was your peace when our people begged for mercy? Where was your compassion when our children died in mines, when our soldiers were thrown into wars that weren't theirs? No, there will be no peace, not until every chain is broken." But even in their fury, humanity did not stand alone. Former slaves of 100 species rose up alongside them. The oppressed saw in humanity's war not just revenge, but justice. They formed militias, joined fleets, and supplied intelligence. Some worlds even revolted against their own governments, tearing down the institutions that had enslaved them. The galaxy was no longer at war with humanity. It was at war with its own sins. On the bridge of the eclipse, Kane stood silent, watching the burning remains of a once great empire drift into the void. His officers cheered around him, but he did not smile. There was no joy in vengeance, only grim satisfaction. Commander Lion Joe stepped beside him. "We've done it," she said quietly. "Draction is free. The markets are gone. Billions are liberated." Kane's eyes were cold as he stared into the stars. "It's a start." "A start," Joe repeated. "We've destroyed one of the greatest empires in the galaxy." "And there are more," Kane replied. "Every planet that profited from our chains will burn. Every civilization that stood by and watched will fall. We've unleashed the fury they taught us, and now it will not stop." And indeed, it didn't. The galaxy had once believed humanity's rage was a storm, powerful but fleeting. But they were wrong. It was not a storm. It was a wildfire, unstoppable and consuming, and it was spreading faster than anyone could contain. The old order of the galaxy was crumbling. Empires that had lasted millennia were falling in mere decades, and at the heart of it all was the species they had once called weak. Humanity had risen. Humanity had unleashed its fury. And the galaxy had no idea how much worse it was going to get. The fall of Draction Prime was more than a victory, it was a message. A message written in fire and blood across the skis of the galaxy. Humanity was no longer a victim. They were no longer the slaves who bowed and begged for mercy. They were the reckoning, and that reckoning was only beginning. In the decades that followed, the war transformed into something the galaxy had never witnessed. It was no longer scattered battles or desperate uprisings. It was a crusade. Humanity, once scattered and powerless, now marched as a unified force with one purpose: to destroy every civilization that had ever profited from their chains. The Terran Retribution fleet struck again and again, each time deeper into enemy territory, each time with greater force. They no longer targeted single planets or isolated stations. They went after the heart of empires. Industrial worlds burned. Capital planets fell. Military strongholds, once thought impenetrable, were reduced to drifting debris. And with every victory, the list of enemies grew shorter. The Forians were the first to fall. Once proud conquerors who had built their wealth on human soldiers forced to fight their wars, they now faced the fury of those same soldiers, free, angry, and relentless. The Terrans bypassed their heavily fortified front lines, slipping behind them to attack their supply chains and fuel depots. Cities starved. Fleets went dark. Within months, the Forian government collapsed. Their homeworld surrendered without a single shot fired. their leaders dragged from their palaces by their own citizens, enraged by centuries of lies. Next came the Tirikians. They had considered themselves philosophers and intellectuals, too enlightened to take part directly in slavery. Yet they had debated its merits in their universities, funded the ships that carried slaves, and enriched themselves with the labor of the oppressed. Humanity did not forget. When the Terrans arrived, they did not bombard Tirikian cities. They hacked their networks, crashing their planetary economies overnight. They exposed secret documents showing their complicity in the slave trade. Riots erupted. Governments fell. When Terran fleets finally entered orbit, they found no armies waiting, only a civilization on its knees, begging for forgiveness that would never come. But the Council still refused to surrender. Driven by pride and fear, the remaining empires formed the largest coalition fleet in history, over 5,000 ships drawn from dozens of species, united by desperation. Their mission was simple: destroy the Terrans before humanity destroyed them all. The battle that followed would be remembered for centuries. It took place above the star of Varen's Eye, where the Council had gathered their forces in a last-ditch attempt to end the war. The Terran Retribution Fleet, though smaller in number, met them without hesitation. The battle raged for 5 days. From the Bridge of the Eclipse, Elia's Kane watched as the void burned. Terran warships moved like predators, weaving through the massive, lumbering fleets of the Coalition. Entire enemy squadrons vanished in sudden flashes of light as Terran railguns and torpedoes tore through their hulls. The Coalition responded with overwhelming firepower, but for every Terran ship destroyed, 3 more took its place. It was not just a battle, it was a slaughter. By the 5th day, the Coalition's proud fleet was gone, scattered and broken. Their flagship, a monstrous dreadnought the size of a city, was boarded and captured. Kane stood on its bridge as Terran soldiers lowered the Council's banners and raised the black and silver flame of Earth in their place. "Broadcast to the galaxy," Kane ordered. His voice was cold, his expression unyielding. "Your fleets are dust. Your armies are gone. Your empires are dying. You called this war justice, we call it memory. You will remember every child taken from its mother, every soul sold into bondage, every scream that echoed in the dark, and for every one of those crimes you will pay." Panic swept through the galaxy. Entire civilizations, once arrogant and untouchable, now fled before humanity's wrath. Worlds that had stood for thousands of years were abandoned. Some species surrendered outright, dismantling their governments and delivering their leaders to Terran war tribunals in exchange for mercy. Others chose to fight to the bitter end and were erased. The Valnari Confederacy, one of the galaxy's oldest powers, tried to resist. They unleashed doomsday weapons, poisoned planets, even burned their own colonies to deny them to the Terrans. None of it mattered. Terran fleets hunted them to extinction, destroying their last warship above their homeworld. As the Valnari capital city burned, Kane's final transmission to them was short and merciless. "Mercy was a privilege you denied us. It is one you will not receive." Yet amid the fire and vengeance, something remarkable happened. On worlds freed from centuries of oppression, former slaves of countless species built new governments. They raised new flags. They formed alliances not based on conquest, but on shared suffering and on gratitude to the humans who had freed them. Many swore eternal loyalty to Earth, pledging fleets and resources to the Terran cause. The galaxy was changing. Humanity was no longer a slave race. They were no longer even just a people. They were a force, a storm that had reshaped the order of the stars. And still Kane pressed on. From the command deck of the Eclipse, he stared at the tactical map that showed the shrinking territories of the old powers. "It's almost over," said Lion Joe quietly. "It's not over," Kane replied. "Not until the last empire that profited from our chains is gone. Not until every world that turned a blind eye has faced judgment." Joe hesitated, "And when that's done?" Kane's eyes were cold and distant. Then we decide what kind of galaxy we will build. By the time the war entered its final phase, the galaxy looked nothing like the one that had enslaved humanity. The great empires were gone or dying. The council was shattered, its members hunted or hiding. The old order had fallen, and in its place, something new was rising. For the first time in history, humanity stood not as victims, but as masters of their destiny. And the galaxy, broken and humbled, waited to see what they would do next. The war that began as a rebellion had become an apocalypse. Entire star systems lay silent, their once mighty empires reduced to ashes. Cities that had stood for millennia were nothing more than scorched ruins drifting among the stars. The Galactic Council, the body that had once dictated the fate of billions, was now a ghost of its former self, scattered and terrified, hiding in forgotten corners of the galaxy. And still, humanity did not stop. They had not forgotten the whips. They had not forgotten the chains. They had not forgotten the generations born in cages and the countless lives extinguished in silence. Every step forward, every victory, was driven by that memory, a memory that no treaty or apology could erase. Elias Kane stood on the bridge of the eclipse and looked out over the galaxy map projected before him. Red markers, the last remaining slave worlds, the final bastions of the Council, blinked faintly. There were not many left. Soon, they too would fall. "How many remain?" he asked quietly. 17 Council strongholds, replied Commander Lion Joe. "Most are heavily fortified. They know we're coming." Kane's eyes narrowed. Then they've had time to prepare their graves. The Terran Retribution Fleet moved with purpose. They were no longer striking opportunistic targets or disrupting trade routes. This was the final campaign, Operation Judgment. Every remaining empire that had once profited from humanity's enslavement would be brought to its knees. Their first target, the Forian homeworld Carthage. Once a proud jewel of the Council, Carthage had enslaved more humans than any other world. Entire generations had lived and died in its mines and factories. Now, humanity was returning not as servants but as executioners. The battle for Carthage was swift and merciless. Terran dreadnoughts shattered planetary shields with kinetic bombardments. Swarms of fighters swept through the skies, annihilating defense platforms and orbital stations. The Forian fleet, once the pride of their empire, was obliterated in hours. But Kane's orders were clear: no civilian targets. Humanity was here to end tyranny, not to replace it. The Forian leaders, the ones who had ordered generations of slavery, were captured alive. They were brought before a tribunal broadcast across the galaxy, their crimes read aloud in cold, unflinching detail. Billions watched as the verdict was delivered. Guilty, every one of them. The executions that followed were not brutal or vengeful. They were quiet, almost clinical, a message that humanity's justice was not about cruelty, but about consequence. One by one, the remaining strongholds fell. The Valkan Dominion gone in 3 days. The Jarethi Syndicate shattered before their fleet even left orbit. The last slaver stronghold on the rim, Usseran Station, tried to negotiate. Kane's response was simple: surrender and face justice or burn. They chose the latter. Usseran no longer existed. But the final battle was still to come. The remnants of the Galactic Council had retreated to a single world, Elendor Prime, the birthplace of the Council itself and the heart of its authority. There, under the protection of what remained of their fleets and armies, they prepared for one last stand. Billions of soldiers were stationed on the planet. Every orbital defense system was online. Every weapon they had ever built was aimed at the skis. They knew the humans were coming, and they knew they would not survive. When the Terran fleet arrived, the stars themselves seemed to disappear under the mass of ships. It was the largest armada humanity had ever assembled: 1,000 warships, hundreds of carriers, and legions of ground troops. At its center, the eclipse drifted silently, its presence alone enough to send waves of panic through enemy ranks. The Council's remaining fleet met them in orbit, a desperate wall of firepower and defiance. The battle was brutal. Dozens of Terran ships were lost in the opening hours, but humanity did not falter. Their resolve was stronger than armor, stronger than numbers. They pressed forward with cold precision, dismantling the enemy's defenses piece by piece. Within 48 hours, the Council fleet was gone. The skies above Elendor Prime were Terran-controlled. Then came the order that would define the war's end. "Commence planetary descent," Kane said. Terran dropships poured into the atmosphere like a rain of fire. They met fierce resistance, entrenched armies, planetary cannons, suicide attacks, but nothing could stop them. Street by street, city by city, humanity advanced. The Council's soldiers fought with desperation, but their hearts were not in it. Many surrendered. Some even defected, unable to continue defending the atrocities of their masters. And finally, after centuries of oppression, the Terran flag was raised over the Council's central spire. The trial that followed was the largest in galactic history. Thousands of Council officials, military leaders, and corporate executives were brought before the Tribunal of Chains. Evidence of centuries of crimes, slavery, genocide, torture was presented. Survivors testified. Histories long buried were brought into the light. One by one, the guilty were condemned. Elendor Prime's halls, once the center of galactic power, became courtrooms for justice. The same chambers where laws had been written to legalize slavery now echoed with the sentences of those who had enforced them. And when the executions came, the galaxy watched in silence, not with horror, but with understanding. This was not vengeance, it was justice. When it was over, Elias Kane addressed the galaxy for the last time. He stood before the ruins of the Council chamber, the Terran flag behind him, and spoke not as a conqueror but as a survivor. "For centuries you called us slaves. You believed we were beneath you, but we endured, we rose, and now we have judged you. But know this, our war is not against life. It is against cruelty. It is against the idea that one species can own another. That idea ends here today with us. If any empire ever again dares to build chains, humanity will rise again, and next time we will not stop with justice." The message was heard in every corner of the galaxy. No one doubted its meaning. Humanity had not just ended slavery, they had made it impossible to rise again. The galaxy was silent in the wake of the final judgment. The old order was gone. The Council was dead. And for the first time in history, the stars were free of the chains that had bound billions for so long. But the war had changed humanity too. They were no longer the broken, desperate species that had once been sold in cages. They were something greater, something that could never again be enslaved. And as Elias Kane stared out into the void from the bridge of the eclipse, he knew one truth above all. They had not won revenge, they had won justice. The war was over. For the first time in living memory, the stars were silent. No more slave fleets drifted across the void. No more auction houses sold lives for profit. The Galactic Council was gone, its palaces turned to rubble, its armies disbanded, its flags burned. In its place stood something new, a galaxy that trembled not from fear of oppression, but from the weight of possibility. Humanity had done the impossible. They had risen from chains and conquered those who had once ruled them. But now, with victory in their hands, a new question loomed before them. What would they become? Elias Kane stood on the bridge of the eclipse, staring into the endless black of space. The map before him showed a galaxy transformed, old borders erased, new alliances forming. But for the first time in decades, there were no red markers, no enemy fleets, no targets. The war was truly over, and yet the silence felt heavier than the gunfire ever had. "They fear us," said Commander Lion Joe quietly, stepping beside him. "They should," Kane replied, his voice low. "We have shown them what we're capable of." "Fear isn't the same as respect," Joe said. "We won the war, But if we rule by fear, we'll become no better than the ones we destroyed. Cain turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. That's why we won't rule, not like they did. The Terran Assembly met for the first time on neutral ground, not Earth, not any of the liberated worlds, but a new station built in the heart of former Council space. It was called Aurora, named after the light that comes after the darkest night. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered there, some former enemies, others once slaves, all of them uncertain of what came next. At the center of the vast chamber stood Cain, the man who had led humanity from the depths of despair to the heights of vengeance. But his voice was not filled with anger now. It was calm, deliberate, and heavy with purpose. For centuries, he said, his voice echoing across the chamber, this galaxy was built on cruelty. The strong enslaved the weak, the powerful devoured the powerless, and for centuries humanity suffered. We begged for help and none came. We asked for mercy and we were given chains. So we forged our own strength, and now the age of chains is over. But we are not here to build a new empire on the ashes of the old. We are not conquerors. We are guardians, and we will not allow any species, human or otherwise, to ever repeat the sins of the past. The words struck like thunder. In that moment, the galaxy understood that humanity had not fought this war for domination. They had fought it so no one would ever live as they had. In the years that followed, the galaxy began to heal. Worlds that had been ravaged by war were rebuilt with Terran aid. Freed slaves of 100 species returned to their homes and began new lives. New alliances were formed, not based on fear or coercion, but on mutual respect and shared pain. The Accords of Aurora were signed, a universal declaration that outlawed slavery, exploitation, and forced servitude in all forms. Any violation would be met with the full strength of the Terran Guard, a new peacekeeping force composed of humans and liberated species alike. And everyone believed the warning written into the first article of the Accords. If the chains rise again, so will we. But victory had come at a cost. Billions of lives had been lost, entire planets lay in ruins, and humanity itself had been forever changed. The fire that had fueled their vengeance had also scarred them. They were no longer the dreamers who had once looked to the stars with wonder. They were warriors now, forged in suffering, tempered in blood. Cain felt that weight every day. He carried the names of the fallen with him, the men and women who had died in the mines, who had perished in the uprisings, who had sacrificed themselves so that others could live free. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he wondered if the price had been too high. One evening, he visited Earth for the first time in decades. The world he had only heard stories of as a child was now a thriving center of the new order. Children ran freely in the streets. Songs filled the air. Statues of former slaves and resistance fighters stood tall in the plazas. Humanity had come home, and they had brought freedom with them. Cain walked alone through the ruins of an old museum, one of the few structures that had survived the centuries of occupation. In a quiet corner, he found a display dedicated to the early days of humanity's enslavement, rusted chains, shattered collars, fragments of old labor tools. He stared at them for a long time. A young girl approached him, no older than 10. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are you Elias Cain?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I am." "My teacher says you freed us," she said. "She says we don't have to be afraid anymore." Cain knelt so he was eye level with her. "You never did," he said gently. "You were always stronger than they believed. We all were. They just needed to remember it." Years turned into decades. Elias Cain eventually stepped down from command, leaving the Terran Guard in the hands of a new generation, one raised not in chains but in freedom. Humanity, once scattered and broken, now stood as the guardians of peace. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they served as a reminder of the price of forgetting. Across the galaxy, stories were told not just of humanity's wrath, but of their resolve. of how they had endured the worst cruelty imaginable and risen to become the protectors of all. Children of every species grew up knowing the same lesson: never enslave, never oppress, never forget. In the end, the galaxy did not remember humanity as conquerors or destroyers. It remembered them as something far more powerful: survivors. It remembered the species that had been born in chains, who had burned empires to dust, and who had sworn that no one else would ever suffer as they had. And somewhere among the stars, the words of Elias Kane echoed, words carved into monuments on 1,000 worlds, words that defined an era. They broke our bodies, they tried to break our spirit, but we are still here, and we will always be here, because freedom is not a gift, it is a promise, and humanity never breaks its promises.